Alright, I think it's about time we hear some good news about Florida. The past couple months have been rough on the Sunshine State. First, Hurricane Ian attempted to blow southwest Florida right off the map. A little over a month later, Hurricane Nicole tried to sneak one last punch onto the Atlantic. If you listen to the overly dramatic news, you might think the whole state of Florida is hurricane battered and completely underwater. But we just spent a month traveling through the state, and we can tell you that's really not the case. Florida and the people that call this place home are resilient. In this video, we're going to take you on a little road trip to show you that the sun is in fact still shining in Florida. The funny thing about this trip is it got rescheduled twice because of hurricanes, but more on that later. Our first stop on our road trip is historic St. Augustine, Florida. Founded in 1565, it's actually the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental US. Well, that's a mouthful. In a lot of ways, St. Augustine doesn't feel like Florida to me. Development-wise, the state is relatively new. But here in St. Augustine, you're surrounded by history. There's a centuries-old Spanish fort, historic wooden buildings, and beautiful architecture. On top of that, there's some great beaches and a lot of local charm. It's hard not to like St. Augustine. We're going to start on one of the most famous streets in the city, which is St. George Street. It's lined with historic buildings, now repurposed into shops, museums, and some of the city's best restaurants. A stroll down the street could take you the better part of the day, if you're up for exploring the shops and lingering at the cafes and restaurants. On this trip, we're going to be staying right in the heart of the action at the St. George Inn to make the most of our days in the city. Our windows and balcony overlook the historic St. George Street, and we're just steps away from all the action, shops, and restaurants. We have a family suite with a nice kitchen and living room to spread out, which is a must when traveling with young kids. The St. George Inn has several room types, and if you're traveling with a family, this is the place to stay. On our first full day, we filled up at breakfast, set in a beautiful courtyard of the St. George Inn, and we tried our best to keep the kids from jumping into the grand fountain. With some food and coffee in our system, we headed out to one of St. Augustine's main attractions, the 300-year-old fort, the Castillo San Marcos. Built in the 1600s by the Spanish, the Castillo was constructed to protect the city and important trade routes. Throughout the centuries, it changed hands several times between the Spanish, British, and the United States, until it was decommissioned in 1933, a few years after it received National Monument status. We spent the morning exploring all the nooks and crannies of the old fort, but our favorite part was on the upper level. Here, along with great views of St. Augustine, there were cool old cannons to see, tourists to hide in, where the kids ran around and pretended they were pirates. Another Spanish relic worth marveling at in St. Augustine is the Fountain of Youth. In the 16th century, the age-old myth of magical water that would reverse aging and cure sickness became popular among explorers. One in particular, Ponce de Leon. He became fixed on finding this mythical water source. This archaeological site is said to be the actual landing point of Ponce de Leon. Since he's not around anymore, I'm not sure the magic water worked, but there is a ton of history to check out while visiting the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park. Besides the sip of minerally water, here you can also get a glimpse back into time, into the life of the early settlers and explorers. This is also thought to be the site of the first Christian missions in what is now the United States. For the kids, there's tons of peacocks to see and feed, as well as some kid-focused archaeological exhibits. Atlas was convinced we were going to find treasures here, and we just about had to pry the shovel out of his hands. All aboard one of the best ways to cover a lot of the city in a short time, the famous green and orange St. Augustine Trolley. The Old Town Trolley tours of St. Augustine are a must, and they're a super fun way to get around town. The kids love the ride, and we got a narrated tour and a few minutes just to sit and watch this charming town go by. It was a fun way to see the city, and it's really the best way to get around. Another must in St. Augustine is a climb up the beautiful black and white striped classic lighthouse. From the top of the lighthouse, you can see Anastasia Island State Park, and in the distance, you can catch a glimpse of the old town as well. For nautical nerds, there's also several exhibits on the lighthouse and maritime history, covering from Ponce de Leon to current day, and everything in between. Now for a little break from all that history and culture of St. Augustine, we spent some time just relaxing on the beach. On top of all that history you can find here, there's some great stretches of sand as well. After all, it is still Florida, and no trip to the Sunshine State would be complete without some time on the beach. We finished up our time here with a visit to the St. Augustine Alligator Farm Zoological Park. Inside we found literally hundreds, if not thousands of alligators. Atlas and Isla loved seeing all the gators and other animals. Besides the alligators, there's lots of primates from around the world, exotic birds, and other reptiles. This place is a must if you're traveling with kids or animal lovers. This hurricane season didn't focus its wrath directly on St. Augustine. The city did see some damage, but nothing that would hinder a visit to this historic gem. Next up on a road trip is a place that's been on our radar for a while, and we finally decided to make it happen. From St. Augustine, we set the GPS for Cape Canaveral and Coca Beach, to an area of the state known as the Space Coast. It got its name from being the home of NASA's launch site for human space travel. Here, just inland from the sandy shores, you'll find Kennedy Space Center, where the Apollo 11 mission launched on its way to the moon in 1969, and many other famous missions before and after that one. However, rockets aren't the only thing that this place has going for it. There's also some great beaches, as well as many other great spots to check out. We made it to town just in time to hit the beach at sunset, and it was a good one. The kids played in the sand while we waited for the sun to sink behind the little beach town of Coca Beach. As it did, the skies lit up in purples and pinks. Even though on the East Coast, the sun doesn't set over the water, the last rays of sun bounce around and make some sky magic anyways. As the light faded, we sat down to what would be one of our favorite meals in the Space Coast. We had dinner right on the beach at Coconuts, a local favorite open-air spot in Coca Beach. Everything was good, but the real standout was the tuna nachos. And yes, they're as good as they sound. While we ate, we could tell the whole town was abuzz about the Artemis launch attempt. Military planes were flying around and people were excited. People really thought tonight was the night that Artemis 1 would launch. This launch would be the first step to putting humans back on the moon in decades. We've been trying to time our trip with this rocket launch for a while now, but after rescheduling twice, we kind of thought that it was just not meant to happen. The first launch attempts back in August and September were scrubbed due to engine issues and hydrogen leaks. And then Hurricane Ian set things back even further. We actually had our car all loaded up and we were ready to head out the door at 5 in the morning the day Ian hit. And needless to say, we scrubbed our mission too. We then rebooked everything trying to see the launch again, and then it turned out we were going to be on the Space Coast on the wrong days. Finally, while we were road tripping around Florida, we found out the launch got pushed out to our first day in Cape Canaveral. Talk about lucky. The only downside, it was set for 1 a.m., but that wasn't going to stop us. We sat up listening to the chatter from the NASA Command Center for hours, waiting and hoping it was going to go. But then at almost 2 a.m., the announcement came that the launch was a go.
3, 2, 1, boosters in ignition, and liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
We rushed downstairs from our hotel, the Cape Canaveral Hampton Inn, to the parking lot, which actually had surprisingly good views of the launch from right outside the room. Unfortunately, our little astronauts weren't up to see this moment in history, which is too bad because Atlas really loves all things space. The next morning, fresh off the high of seeing a rocket launch into space, and a little short on sleep, we headed to the Kennedy Space Center, which is where the rocket took off only a few hours earlier. And of all the things we did in Space Coast, this was a big hit with everyone. Just a few steps in and we were greeted with a large collection of giant rockets from all periods of space exploration, in what's known as the Rocket Garden. Everywhere you turn in the Kennedy Space Center, there are interactive exhibits. You can practice things like your space shuttle docking skills or pretend to pilot a ship through outer space. The amount of giant, life-size space equipment at the Kennedy Space Center is so impressive, and it gives you a real feel for the history of space exploration. Even if you aren't a huge space geek, you really need to put this place on your bucket list. There's also a huge indoor playground, which of course is space themed. This is a good place to get the kids moving, and it's a lot of fun for both mini astronauts and kids that are on outer space overload. We even got to have a snack with an astronaut, which Atlas still talks about to this day. Now we spent the whole day here, and I know for a fact we did not see it all. And we'll be back again as the kids grow. We really enjoyed our time here in Coca Beach and the whole Space Coast. But we totally did not plan enough time here. We left more than a few stones unturned, but we know we'll definitely be back here sooner than later. With history and space checked off our list, it was time for some relaxation, so we headed another couple hours down the coast to Vero Beach. We talked to a lot of people that really love this beach town, so we decided to check it out for ourselves. But on our way to our final destination, we had a few stops planned before we planted our toes in the sand. First up was LaPorte Farms, home to an interactive zoo filled with animals from around the world. This little gem in the town of Sebastian is a fun 5-acre, not-for-profit farm. Here you'll find everything from cockatoos and chickens to zebras and zebus. We made friends with lots of animals by feeding them by hand. There's lots of animals and exhibits, and it's a fun way to spend an afternoon with kids or animal lovers. Now, we couldn't visit Florida's Treasure Coast without a stop to Mel Fisher's Treasure Museum. I had heard of Mel Fisher, but really had no idea the stories and the sheer amount of treasures he and his crews actually found. His most notable find was the Atasha, a Spanish shipwreck that had 40 tons of gold and silver on board when it went down. And not to mention thousands of emeralds. When Mel's team found it in 1975, the treasure was valued at over $450 million. Mel Fisher just seemed like a really interesting guy too. I mean, just look at this bust of him with gold chains hanging from his neck. It gave you a small glimpse into his super interesting life. Inside the museum, they even have a 5-pound gold block where the gold itself is worth at least $50,000 that they let you hold. How many museums will let you do that? However, the really interesting part to me was that Mel Fisher and his team only found about half of the Atasha's treasures. A large part of the ship is still thought to be out there. And if you're looking for a career change, they're hiring full-time divers to look for treasure in Key West right now. Another fun stop for kids is the Environmental Learning Center, or ELC as the locals call it. Here we found 65 acres of pristine Florida wilderness. There's an extensive system of trails and boardwalks that bring you between different ecosystems and exhibits on the property. Boat rides can also be arranged to explore even more of the Indian River and the nature that surrounds the ELC. One of our favorite stops around the Vero Beach area was the McKee Botanical Gardens. Just stepping into these lush gardens was like walking straight into the jungle. You know, if the jungle was like finely manicured with koi ponds and stuff. But seriously, just look at this place. We probably would have spent even longer here if we didn't stumble upon the super fun kids area, complete with a splash pad. And, well, we proceeded to get completely soaked, which cut our visit a little bit short, but it was definitely worth a stop. Now it was time to head to our final stop, the beach, and our hotel for some dry clothes. Our final stop in Florida was actually the first place where we saw any noticeable effects from the hurricanes in 2022. Looking down the beach, it kind of looked like someone took a few giant scoops of sand away from the beach. And right after Hurricane Nicole, there was some road damage. But how much did it impact our trip? Not at all. The beach was still gorgeous, the sunsets are still stunning, and from a tourist perspective, life was good. And that's not to take away from the locals and the businesses that were heavily affected by the hurricanes. There's quite a few people that lost everything, and that's not something to take lightly. But it's also not a reason to avoid Florida. Many people and businesses depend on tourists for their livelihood to stay open. After a busy week traveling Florida's Atlantic coast, it was time to settle in and relax at the beachside Kimpton Vero Beach Hotel. Our room was well appointed with a spacious living area with plenty of room for all of us. The living room led out to the balcony overlooking the pool with views of the ocean, making it the perfect spot for a morning coffee or a glass of wine after the kids were down. Once we got here, it was a bit hard to leave, but that was okay with us. The Kimpton has 2 on-site restaurants, a spa, a nice pool, and of course, the beach. Another bonus, it was within walking distance to many other nearby attractions, shopping, and dining. And of all the fun things we did on this road trip, some of the best memories were just having some family fun, splashing around, learning to float and jump off the edge like little daredevils. The Kimpton Vero Beach was the perfect place to end an action-packed trip. And just like that, our Florida road trip is lights out, like a kid that played way too hard in the pool. We hope you enjoyed traveling around Florida's Atlantic coast with us and exploring all the history, beautiful beaches, and the literally out-of-this-world activities. We also hope we showed you that the sun is still shining in Florida and it's ready for your next family vacation.